உலகெங்கும் தமிழரின் பிம்பம் உங்கள் TVI.
Welcome to CrossRoads on TVI, a show that showcases the Tamil Canadian community, their issues and their successes. I am your host, Manjula Salvaraja. Today we will speak to two people who are hoping in their own ways to fire up our political system. First, we'll speak to Justin Trudeau, Member of Parliament for Papineau, Quebec, and a candidate for the leadership of the Liberal Party of Canada. Next, we'll speak to Alison Loat, the co-founder of Samara, a research and advocacy group working to improve political engagement in Canada. They have a new report out there that's getting a lot of media attention on how Canadians feel about their democracy, and be warned, the report is somewhat grim. Alison will join us later to share some of her findings. Let's get started. Justin Trudeau is the Member of Parliament for Papineau, Quebec, and a candidate for the leadership of the Liberal Party of Canada. He has been the Liberal Party critic for youth, post-secondary education, amateur sports, multiculturalism, citizenship and immigration. Formerly a teacher and the chair of Katimavik, Canada's National Youth Service Program, Justin has a Bachelor of Arts degree from McGill University and a Bachelor of Education degree from the University of British Columbia. He sat down with us to share his thoughts on rebuilding the Liberal Party. Here's that interview. Thank you for joining us on CrossRoads. It's such a pleasure to have you on.
No, it's a pleasure to be here, Manjula.
Great. So let's start with the easy question first. You declared your interest in running to be the head of the Liberal Party early October. Why are you running?
I'm running because I love this country. Because I feel and I see in my travels across the country that this government is bringing this country in a direction that most Canadians don't want it to go. We're turning negative, we're turning polarized, we're being turned against each other for political gains by this government at a time when we need to be pulled together and step up. And the one thing that I learned through my years in politics in representing Papineau, which is an extraordinary diverse riding, was it's so important to bring people together because people want to be brought together. They want to be engaged in common causes, and politics is too much about division these days. So my focus and why I'm in politics is because I fundamentally believe that I have something to offer that's going to make this world a better place for my kids and for all of us.
Now, Justin, I'm sure you've heard some critics out there say that you may be young or inexperienced. How do you respond to that?
I think it's time to seriously look at a generational change. I don't think that age is limiting in any particular way. There are prime ministers and people who got into politics younger than I did who've been very successful. Others who've been less successful, just like people of age and experience who've been more or less successful. What matters is what someone brings forward and their capacity to draw around them, yes, wise experts in all fields, but also mostly gather around them Canadians from across the country who want to be part of generating solutions and opportunities for themselves and their communities that aren't otherwise being generated. So my capacity to bring people together, to engage with Canadians and to work towards a common cause is something that is at the center of my campaign and makes me qualified to be leader of the Liberal Party and Prime Minister of this country.
Well, so let's go back to that ambition there. I mean, if you do become the leader of the Liberal Party, you'll have to convince Canadians that the Liberal Party is the one to lead the government as opposed to the NDP or the Conservatives. How do you think your vision for Canada is different from what these other parties are proposing?
Well, I think one of the things that we can see is that these days in politics, everyone's moving towards the center. So, the differences around policies don't tend to be as great, although there are very clear and stark differences. the biggest difference is in tone, is in approach. And both the other two parties, the NDP and the Conservatives, have demonstrated a willingness to create policies that isolate certain parts of the country, that push back at other parts of the country, that really play to the people who will vote for them, as opposed to looking to reach out and pull together all Canadians. And that difference for me is what we have to attack. Now, it's going to be a huge challenge because Canadians are incredibly cynical about politics these days. We've been divided so effectively between left and right. We're much more in the mode of voting against a political party than voting for one we like. We're willing to put up with the least worst of the options out there as opposed to actually wanting to build something. And what my entire leadership run, and hopefully my approach if I get to be leader of the Liberal Party, is going to be all about, is taking on that cynicism dead on and saying, I know that Canadians are tired of expecting the worst from their leaders. I know that Canadians are tired of being cynical about politics. Let us build together once again. Let's not pick answers that are good for the people who are willing to vote for me, that put out the people who won't. Let's not make this about punishing people who don't support me, which is what the Conservatives are very good at. Let's make this about all of us figuring out what's going to work to make Canada the most prosperous, successful, educated, ambitious, confident country that we can possibly make it. And that message is completely different from what the other parties are putting forward. Now, the challenge we have right now is, as you say, we're in a very weakened position in our numbers. We're at 35 seats in the House of Commons. And people say, oh, that's a huge challenge. I actually see that as a huge opportunity because it allows us to invent and create ourselves anew in a way that we wouldn't be able to if we were sitting at 100 seats. We get to completely reorganize, reimagine, reinvigorate, engage a whole new generation of young leaders and of people who've stayed away from politics for too long through their professional lives to come in and serve their country. And that opportunity is one of the things that excites me most about the challenge, but also the potential in the coming years for the Liberal Party of Canada.
Well, then let's talk about the Tamil Canadian community specifically. You must know that there was some level of frustration with the Liberal Party going back to 2009 when there were these large demonstrations happening in Ottawa and Toronto. And the sense was that it was somewhat a timid or a not strong enough response from the Liberal Party to people here, Tamil Canadians, that were worried about how their relatives and friends in Sri Lanka were faring. Yes, it's 2009, we're in 2012, but I think there needs to be a rebuilding of that relationship between the Liberal Party and the folks within the Tamil Canadian community that supported them. How do you plan to do that?
I intend to do that by doing what I've started doing in this leadership, is reaching out to as many different community leaders, engaging with them, meeting here with you today, continuing to stay as engaged as I can with the concerns of this community. I think there were mistakes made by the party in the past, decisions that I hate to say weren't unique to the Tamil community. I mean, we went from having 170 seats in 2000 to a steady decline to 135 to 100 to 75 to 35 now, straight through. Because we lost our connection. We took for granted people who'd always supported us. We weren't there for them. We weren't taking bold enough stances because we were worried what the Conservatives might say about. There was, as you say, an awful lot of timidity around the Liberal Party's position. And as someone who has the privilege of representing a community in Montreal with I think the largest Tamil population in Montreal, certainly the biggest temple is in my riding, and they're very close ties to community leaders within the Tamil community in Montreal, which is less organized and strong as a community in the GTA, but is still a very important community to me to engage with. I'm very, very hopeful that the kinds of approach that I'm trying to bring for the Liberal Party across the country, across communities, of reaching out, of listening, of engaging, of taking strong stands on positions of human rights and values remains at the center of what the Liberal Party exists for.
That's great. Good to hear. Well, so let me take you to something that I heard that I thought was interesting. And I think this was interesting to me in the context of the conversation that was happening when the boat of migrants, the two boats of migrants, Tamil migrants, came to our shores. I heard of an interesting statement that you made during a speech where you talked about the concept of equality and how it plays out in the 21st century versus the 20th century. Can you tell us about that? Because you have it seems like in that speech you had a very clear vision.
Well, one of the things that came up when the Sun Sea and the Ocean Lady came to our shores is this idea that we have to protect Canadians more than everyone else. And when we look at what refugees are, they're people fleeing for their lives. And the fact that the government is willing to torque up differences between communities and get people who are already here to start closing the door on the generosity that has always defined Canada, it really starts to ask about our fundamental values. For me, if the 20th century was one in which we very much approached the idea of rights, whether it was women's right to vote, or the fight against fascism, or the civil rights movement in the United States, or the achievement of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms here in Canada, the 20th century was very much about rights. I think the 21st century is going to be about recognizing the fundamental value of every single human being, of every single citizen. And that approach to saying, you can't treat people differently because you disagree with them or because you're worried about where they come from. That's a thing that is fundamental. It's not just enough to recognize their rights. You have to realize that people have an opportunity to contribute, to shape a story to tell, and everyone is bound together by a core desire to be relevant to the world around them. And if we remove from people the capacity to shape their communities, to be important to the world around them, we remove any sense of achievement. And that is a fundamental attack on their basic reality as a human being. And our approach being equal needs to be much stronger than that.
Thank you. And I'll have one final question for you, because I know you have a busy schedule. So
I've always got time for you.
Okay. So the last one is about the youth vote. We have a younger demographic that watches CrossRoads, and the youth vote across any community in Canada has been on the decline for many years. How do you think just everyone in Canada, especially politicians, can sort of reinvigorate that vote? Because we can't have these numbers decline further. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I have a whole lot of thoughts on that. I've actually been one of the only politicians who has consistently spent an inordinate amount of time reaching out to young people. And what I've seen over the past 5 years is that, contrary to what people tend to say when they're not thinking about it, we have a generation of young people who are incredibly informed, incredibly aware, but also incredibly engaged in the world around them, whether it's local community clubs or school organizations.
So you don't think it's a matter of apathy?
No, I don't think it's apathy. I think sometimes young people are apathetic, but it's not because they don't care about the world, but because they care so much, they're frustrated that they don't get given the tools to be heard and to make a difference. And that's where they get cynical and disconnected. So at the same time as we have young people getting involved in human rights organizations, Amnesty International, Greenpeace, any range of things, they're not seeing that politics is a worthwhile investment of their time and their effort. And that's, for me, what we have to address. We have to start folding young people into our political thoughts, our political processes, giving them space to express their opinions, to share their ideas and solutions. Because as we're looking at the challenges in the coming decades, we realize that the status quo just isn't good enough. We're going to have to be bold about making deep changes in our behaviors, in our assumptions, whether it's around environment or equality or poverty or or economic benefit, or whatever it is, we're going to have to be strong about saying, okay, what has got us to this place right now needs to be questioned as we move forward. And around that pivot that we're at in our civilization, if we don't engage the idealists, the long-term thinkers, the dynamic dreamers that are our young people, then it's not just about not getting enough people out to vote. It's about depriving ourselves of exactly the kinds of voices that are going to give us the capacity to create a new world and do it right. So for me, what I'm all about is re-engaging not just the young people who aren't voting, but the tremendous numbers of people of all ages who are disengaging from the political process because they're tired of the easy attacks, of the short-term solutions, of the politics of division that holds so much sway, and they want to be doing something positive. Well, I need to, and we need to, start to make politics about building again, about something positive, and that, more than anything else, with bold ideas and a fresh outlook that's not afraid to challenge the way things have always been done, is what I think we're going to do to bring the young people engaged and excited about the possibilities and their voices in the coming years.
Good words to end with. It's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Real pleasure.
And we hope to welcome you again sometime.
I look forward to the next time I come by.
Thank you, Justin.
Thank you.
Welcome back to CrossRoads on TVI with Manjula Selvarajah. Alison Loat is the co-founder and executive director of Samara, a McKinsey alumnus. She co-founded Canada 25, an organization that focuses on engaging Canadians under 35 in the development of public policy. She was chosen as one of Canada's top 25 under 30 by Maclean's magazine, is a graduate of Queen's University, the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and an associate fellow and instructor at the University of Toronto. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Our pleasure. So perhaps just to get our audience familiar with your organization, you can tell us a little bit about Samara.
Sure. Samara is a charitable organization that I co-founded about 3.5 years ago, and our goal is to try to improve political participation in Canada. So we know when we look internationally, Canada is recognized as one of the strongest and healthiest democracies in the world, but then we look at things that we know are happening at home, like voting has been going down for over a generation, despite millions and millions of dollars of efforts and advertising. We know from public opinion research that Canadians are less and less satisfied with politics. So we thought it was worth trying to think a little bit about how we could reconnect citizens to politics so it serves people better in the way that we'd like.
Now, you have had a series of reports that the organization has been working on recently. Can you bring us up to speed on some of these?
Sure. Well, we started our organization by initiating Canada's first ever series of exit interviews with former members of Parliament. So, of course, we know exit interviews are very common in a lot of organizations. When a senior executive or a senior leader is leaving, we take the time to ask them how it went, what advice they would have, with an idea of trying to improve the organization for those who are to come. And that's never been done before in the history of one of, I think, the most important workplaces in our country, which is our Parliament. So we thought it would be an interesting way to start a conversation about how we can better connect citizens to politics, how we can strengthen the role of our members of Parliament by talking to people who had served there. So we have now spoken to over almost 80 former members of Parliament from all backgrounds, all across the country, and talked to them about what politics was like on the front line, so to speak, and what advice they would have.
Well, you know, that's interesting. So I'm going to come back to that report, that exit interview report, which is, I think, an older report. But refer to your, let's start with actually talking about your latest one, which is the one that's making all the, I'm sure you've been getting a couple of calls about this, because in the latest report, you actually show that there is a decline of satisfaction that Canadians have with their democracy. Can you speak about the findings in that report?
Sure. We have initiated a series of reports, which are really research projects that are intended to try to provoke discussion on how democracy works and pick up on some of the themes we heard from the MPs. So the one we recently put out was a bit sad, but also I think there's some hope in there, of course. And it just showed, unfortunately, that there's been quite a large drop in Canadian satisfaction with democracy in a pretty short period of time. So our research found that only just over half of Canadians reported being satisfied with democracy, which is about a 20-point drop in less than a decade. And when we asked them about why, we tried to dig under why that was, a lot had to do with frustrations they felt about their political representation, and specifically the sense that MPs were doing a much better job representing their political parties than they were their constituents.
Now, what's interesting is that the numbers that you point out to was something like, I think in 2004, it shows that there were 75% of Canadians that were satisfied. Meanwhile, when you did the poll this time around, 2012, it's 55%. So there's actually been a 20% drop, which is substantial. And in talking about the other details that you shared about people being frustrated with what their MPs are focusing on, what did MPs actually tell you in their exit interviews?
Well, this was sort of one of the, I guess, interesting pieces of continuity between these two separate projects. One of the set of questions we asked the MPs was obviously about how they spent their time when they were in Ottawa. And, obviously everybody had a various version of that story, but when they were describing the more frustrating moments, they pointed their finger in a direction that certainly I thought was going to be quite unexpected, which was towards their own political party. So it was the sense that their party was frustrating a lot of what they felt was the reason that they were sent to Ottawa or the work they thought they could do. And so I kind of thought to myself at the time, I would have thought an MP is a very stalwart of a political party. So if they are feeling so frustrated with their very own parties, is it any wonder why citizens are so often not members of parties or don't see them as effective vehicles to get involved in politics? And then so that was sort of one finding. And then, of course, here we fast forward and talk to citizens about their views on politics, and we see the same theme coming up about parties. And it's really too bad because parties are the vehicle through which Canadians are meant to be involved in politics. And if both MPs and citizens are feeling that they're at odds with what they're trying to do, either as MPs or as individual citizens, it feels like maybe the political party is an area where we need to be focusing some conversation.
So I know that in the polls that you did, my understanding is that you actually brought the same question up with your respondents to say how did they feel their MP was, how deep was that connection to the MP, and what did you get out of that? I mean, what are some of the findings in that area?
Sure. Well, this goes back to the MP interviews as well. One of the questions we asked the MPs was, what is the job of an MP? And we thought that was going to be a sort of warm-up question. And we found that there were about as many answers to that question as there were members of Parliament. And sometimes they would describe it by saying things like, my job is to be at home and serve my constituents. It's not to be up in Ottawa doing that highfalutin stuff. And then on the flip side, you'd have, a same job, a different person, but same job, saying, my job is to be making countries laws for the good of the country. It's not to be ministering to the needs of my constituents every day. So, really diametrically opposed points of view. So what we did in this bit of research is actually took some of the major elements of the job that the MPs articulated and asked Canadians how they thought that MPs were doing. So for example, we picked 5 or 6 different answers the MPs had been given. One is holding members of government to account. Another is representing constituents, representing political parties, serving the needs of constituents. And unfortunately, across all of those jobs, Canadians gave their MPs pretty low marks, usually less than 50%, the exception being representing political parties, which Canadians thought was a pretty unimportant part of the MP's job, but one for which they gave MPs a much higher grade. So we tried to dig under, the usual, I'm just frustrated across the board, and tried to parse out, well, what exactly is it about the MP's job that is particularly frustrating to you as a citizen? And again, what we're trying to do there is just go beyond the usual complaining and actually trying to get a sense of what do Canadians expect of their members of Parliament, what do they want them to be doing, and that kind of message we hope will help strengthen the ability of an MP over time to act in ways that the public would like.
That's interesting, because what I'm hearing from you, therefore, from what your research shows, your organization's research shows, is that your respondents felt that MPs tend to stand with the party more than they do with their constituents. Am I right?
Exactly right. And again, it kind of goes back to, in an ideal world, there wouldn't be a, completely, a contested relationship between parties and citizens. Parties are meant to be how citizens get involved in politics, and they're supposed to represent a collective view of people. So it's really, I think, unfortunate, because political parties are so important, as are members of parliament, that they're seeing themselves at odds with each other. So that was a bit unexpected, at least for me.
So I'm going to stop you for a second, because I just realized that I actually hadn't asked you about how many people you did the study with. Can you give us some insight? Because
Sure.
I think our audience would appreciate that.
Of course. There were about 2,300 people that participated in this survey. And we were very careful to do what you call oversample for groups of people who tend to not be heard as much in public opinion research. And so that was young people, new Canadians, so people, or immigrants, or people who were new citizens, and then the third group was people of lower income. And so we did that to make sure that we were more representative of the country, and that we could speak to it across the board. So it was a pretty big group of people, bigger than you'll get in most polls or surveys.
Did you find that the results varied by any particular segment, like by, I don't know, provincially, or by age or gender or anything of that nature?
Yeah, well, there were a couple of differences. The only big difference was a regional one. Although there was very little difference across the provinces, Francophone Quebecers were much more likely to be dissatisfied than English-speaking Canadians from anywhere else. So that was one big group that felt differently. Otherwise, there was really no regional difference across the country. People who were older and wealthier were slightly more likely to be satisfied. People who voted Conservative were slightly more likely to be satisfied. But again, not huge differences, and certainly not as much as I might have anticipated.
So your organization's obviously had some time to sort of think through this. What are some of the recommendations you see bubbling up that you think could sort of bridge this divide?
Well, part of why we do this is try to encourage a discussion on that across a lot of people, because we've got some views, but we certainly don't have all the answers. So we think if we can put some interesting facts out there and start a conversation, that's terrific. So there's a couple things in particular that, to us anyway, this research points to. The first one goes back to this: what is a job of a member of parliament? When we asked the MPs that in the question, in our interviews with them, we had so many different answers. And sometimes they would cite and compare the job to another one, except it was a job that had nothing in common with each other. So they'd say, oh, it's like being a doctor, a lawyer, a teacher. Somebody said it was like being a guard dog. So I kind of think, okay, well, that's funny on one hand, but on the other, if MPs themselves don't have a shared sense of what they're doing, no wonder there's such conflict and disagreement about how they should be spending their time. And if MPs can't clearly articulate what the core functions of the job are, of course citizens are going to be disappointed. It's probably fair to assume that citizens also have just as varied a view and are going to be disappointed when an MP doesn't do what they think they should be doing. So, this might be a little provocative, but maybe it's time we had a job description for our members of parliament. So, we often say, if you're a teacher, maybe an exercise you can do with your students is say, what should a job description for an MP be? I have a job description, you probably have a job description. It would be great if our elected representatives did too. So that's one. A second area is going back to this, what is the role of the political party? If MPs are frustrated with parties, if citizens are feeling that political parties aren't necessarily doing what they should be, I think it's important to say, are political parties doing what we want them to do to advance good politics through which Canadians can get involved? I know from being around this work that there are a lot of Canadians who have tried to get involved in political parties and don't hear back. If you live in name any town anywhere in the country and you wanted to participate in politics through your party, could you? Is there a place you could go? Could you go to a website for information? Sadly, not really. So I think maybe we could think about political parties, rather than just ways of getting people elected every 4 years, as vehicles through which Canadians can engage in their politics in a more regular way. So those are a couple of things that this research anyway leads us to try to hope for.
Wonderful. So what are the next steps in terms of this research? It seems like you have a couple more reports that are coming out. Is that right?
Yeah, we do. So we have a big series, which we call the Samara Democracy Reports. So the next piece of work we're doing is actually analyzing the content of the conversation in the House of Commons. One of the other findings in this research that we didn't talk about is that 2/3 of Canadians feel that the House of Commons does not address the issues that they care about. So we actually, for all of 2012, have been researching and looking at what debates are taking place there and analyzing them against the issues that Canadians say they care about. So we'll be putting that research out in late January or early February of 2013, which is fast upon us, I know. And all of our research is available on our website at samaracanada.com.
Wonderful, Alison. Thank you so much. That was wonderful research, and we look forward to seeing the other ones that are come up, especially the breakdown of what is actually happening in the House. I think that would be valuable to our audience. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd love to talk to you about it anytime.
Pleasure.
Thanks.
There you have it, folks. And with those two interviews, we hope to launch a series of discussions in the new year on Tamil Canadians and their engagement in Canadian politics. It's going to be a great 2013. Thank you all for joining us. You've been watching Crossroads on TVI with Manjula Salvaraja.
தமிழரின் பிம்பம் உங்கள் டிவி.